Welcome to this month's On One Foot Jewish Faculty Lecture. I am so thrilled that Professor Ifft Decker is returning for, is this your second or your third? Could this be your third lecture? I think
I
it's definitely at least, you've done at
think
least
it's
one.
my second.
Second. Okay, well, welcome back, Professor Ifft Decker. It is a pleasure to have you. Professor Ifft Decker is an assistant professor of history at Rhodes College, and I'm so thrilled that she is returning for her second On One Foot faculty lecture. And with that, I will officially turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I've got a few slides. And just to kind of give you a sort of little bit of an introduction very briefly. I'm a historian of the medieval Western Mediterranean. My first book looked at Jewish and Christian women's work in medieval Catalan cities. And now, as I'll talk about a little bit more, I'm sort of looking at kind of intersections between Jewish and Christian legal culture and looking at documents from Spain and Italy and southern France, essentially. All right. So on June 18th, 1492, the town crier of Palermo read out an edict that would transform the lives of the Jews of Sicily forever, an edict of expulsion. Since the 13th century, the island kingdom of Sicily had been part of a geographically extensive monarchy known as the Crown of Aragon. Aragon was one of several Christian-ruled kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. Its union with the Kingdom of Castile, accomplished by the marriage between King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile in the late 15th century, is what would create the modern country of Spain. As inhabitants of Aragon's wider Mediterranean empire, the Jews of Sicily were therefore also included in what we typically refer to as the 1492 Spanish expulsion. Their deadline to leave for the Jews in Sicily was extended until January 12th, 1493, but eventually, like their counterparts in cities and towns across Castile and Aragon, the Jews of Sicily would be forced to en masse to abandon either their homes or their faith. In Palermo, Sicily's leading city and home to the island's largest Jewish community, many Jews spent the months between June and January developing their own complex responses to the expulsion. Those who planned to emigrate had to wrap up local business affairs, collect and pay debts, and sell property. They had to make plans for departure and decide where they would attempt to establish a new home. Of course, the Jews of Sicily also had another option, one that required them to make a difficult choice. Instead of leaving their homes, they could instead convert to Christianity and remain in Sicily. In the context of mass expulsion, the choices that people made about conversion and migration could tear families apart. My remarks today will focus on a set of documents from the city of Palermo, which offer a poignant window onto individual Jews' responses to this moment of crisis and upheaval. I came across these documents in the context of research for the larger project that I mentioned before, which is on Jews' engagement with Christian legal culture in the late medieval Western Mediterranean. And I'm particularly focused on how Jews are using a particular category of legal professionals called the notaries. So they're legal professionals as well as public officials who record a wide variety of contracts, including loans, real estate sales, last wills, and marriage contracts. You might see notaries today in your local, FedEx or UPS. Today, they really just kind of stamp and sign things and give this kind of authorization and make something a kind of publicly recognized fact. When we're looking at this medieval Mediterranean context, they did that, but they also essentially kind of function as a type of lawyer, basically, and that they're also the people who would have the legal expertise to draw up valid contracts. The notaries therefore form part of a wider secular legal system. They received their authority generally from kings, lords, or municipal governments. Even this legal system, however, was in many ways shaped by Christian religious culture, including a social hierarchy rooted in religious identity. And Jews had a distinct legal status that marked them as both different from and inferior to their Christian neighbor. And so we'll see that Jews often even are often tend to be referred to as such, that they have this label of the Latin Judaeus typically applied to them. So for my current project, I'm especially interested in how Jews in the medieval Mediterranean relied on the notaries to draw up contracts related to family law, including inheritance, marriage, and divorce. And the reason that this is interesting is because Jewish communities in Palermo and these other medieval Mediterranean cities are self-governing, meaning that they had the right to follow halakha, or Jewish law, in all internal matters. Intermarriage is essentially not a legal option. It's only really in the context of conversion that you see religiously mixed families. So because of that, family affairs are by definition almost always things that are confined within the Jewish community. But there are some Jews who chose to go to the Christian notaries to draw up Latin contracts related to inheritance, marriage, and divorce that often actually function as a supplement to similar contracts that were written in Hebrew or Aramaic by Jewish scribes. So now I'm focusing on essentially why Jews might make this choice and what these contracts tell us about interactions between Jews and Christians. And I'm also especially interested in the gender dynamics at work in these contracts. So did men and women have different reasons for pursuing Latin documentation? And did they have different experiences obtaining this documentation? This is a type of contract that in the grand scheme of notarial documentation is relatively rare. But the massive volume of documentation produced by these notaries means that I already have about 700 examples of this type of contract spread across Catalonia, Sicily in particular. That's the only place in Italy I've looked at so far, and southern France, working mostly in Marseille. So the notaries would give copies of contracts to their clients. These were drawn up on parchment or animal skin, but they also then kept abbreviated copies for their own records in registers, and that's what you can see on the screen here. This big thing here is the cardboard cover, essentially, for one of these registers. Most people tend to assume that very few sources have survived from the Middle Ages, but many cities in Spain, in southern France, and in Italy have hundreds of surviving notarial registers, some from as early as the 13th century. So this is a register from that's in the Archivio di Stato in Palermo, which is what you can see the lovely early modern fresco that you can see as you walk into the archive, as well as some construction work that's happening, of course, as is often the case. And the register itself that I've shown here is one that kind of gives you maybe a good sense of scale. Palermo has a number of registers that are especially physically substantial, containing upwards of 2,000 pages. They are genuinely quite heavy to have to carry across the room, which you do have to do yourself as a researcher. But we really have thousands upon thousands of surviving contracts. This is, I will also note, is an actual research process that can be a challenging one. Very few of these documents have been digitized, so that means that almost all of my research is done on site, in person, in the archives in Europe. Many of these archives have quite limited hours, so one of the ones that I work in Barcelona is now open 3 days a week for 3 hours per day. Which is a delightful choice that was made in the context of the pandemic that they have not yet changed. Sometimes archives also remove items from circulation, either permanently or temporarily. So for example, I know I'm not going to be, unfortunately, going back to this particular archive in Palermo this summer, because in October I got an email telling me that all of the notarial registers were being taken out of circulation for an indefinite period of time so they could do something with them. I'm hopeful, but not that confident that I will be able to go back at some point before I complete this project. And even when I'm able to look at the registers I want to, I often will spend the day looking through hundreds of contracts and find only a few that are directly relevant to what I'm actually doing. Moreover, as you can see here, just to kind of give you an example of what these contracts look like. So these are contracts that are written in Latin. They're in scripts that are often difficult to read. I'll say this is actually one of the better ones. But these challenges do, however, make finding these documents especially rewarding. So all of these contracts means that I have many, many different case studies that I could talk about, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus in depth on 2 of these intriguing documents. And these are both documents drawn up in the city of Palermo on the eve of the expulsion, so in the months between the announcement of the expulsion in June 1492 and the deadline to leave in January 1493. And ironically, one of the things that I found is that the legal violence of expulsion enacted by their Christian overlords then in turn made Jews especially dependent on the Christian legal system. So if you go through the notarial registers for this approximately 6 month period, they're filled with documents that demonstrate the extent to which Jewish families had to rely on these Christian notaries to wrap up their affairs. Today, I explore one specific way that Jewish women and their families responded to the communal crisis of the expulsion, getting divorced. So, Christians cannot legally get divorced in the Middle Ages, but Jews can, although it can only officially be initiated by the husband. And I'm focusing here on two case studies. First is a couple that divorced in the wake of the husband's conversion to Christianity, and the other is a couple that divorced over a disagreement about where to resettle. Both of these contracts were drawn up in Latin by Christian notaries, and both indicate that the couple had already obtained a Jewish divorce decree, the get. This combination of Latin and Hebrew Aramaic documentation formed a crucial part of Jewish women's strategic responses to the crisis of the expulsion. They relied on the service of both Christian notaries who drew up these Latin contracts that are modeled on Roman law, and Jewish notaries and scribes who wrote Hebrew and Aramaic contracts in accordance with Jewish law. I'll note that very few of Hebrew and Aramaic contracts from this period have survived, but they're often cited in the Latin documentations. We have a lot of references to them. The Latin documents would provide added security for Jewish women who are working to both legally end their marriages and protect their property. So they can't replace something like a get because the get is what actually affects the divorce, the Jewish bill of divorce. But this is a useful way, essentially, of then being able to demonstrate in other contexts that you're divorced and that, this is what's happening with your property, essentially. We can also see that Jewish women are participating in a multilingual contractual culture, which required familiarity with both the legal system of the wider Christian society and that of the self governing Jewish minority community. I'll also be addressing a little bit about how this breakup of families might have impacted women, as couples made a range of decisions around their responses to the expulsion. And the reason that I focused on divorce is because I find these contracts provide an especially striking insight into how choices surrounding conversion and migration, suddenly precipitated by the crisis of expulsion, created new challenges for families. It is also worth noting that Jewish women would have had to take on new economic responsibilities and challenges after getting divorced. So, by reading the expulsion through the lens of gender, I hope to expand our understanding of how this moment of crisis impacted individual Jews and especially women. So, of course, one of the most profound changes that could divide Jewish families in the context of expulsion was the choice made by some members of the Jewish community to convert to Christianity. Those who chose to convert could remain in the places that their families had called home for generations. However, this choice to convert had the potential to divide families. Often, a husband converted while his wife remained Jewish. Divorces prompted by conversion had, of course, happened before the expulsion as well. And in the Iberian Peninsula, we actually have a lot of these cases because there are these massacres and mass conversions in the late 14th century. But in Palermo, the expulsion is really what first transforms divorce into a mass phenomenon. One of the many couples who divorced as a result of conversion were Sadia di Agra, who, upon his baptism and conversion to Christianity, had taken the new name of Giovanni di Manzanillo. Converts usually will take a new Christian name, and his wife Rica, who was still Jewish. They lived in Agrigento, about 80 miles from Palermo. When Rika and Sadia/Giovanni went to a Christian notary on October 16th, 1492, they were at this point already divorced in accordance with Jewish law. And even though Giovanni had converted, he had already provided his wife with the Jewish bill of divorce, with the get. And this is worth noting because the process of obtaining a get from a convert husband was something that could require fraught, complex, and protracted negotiations. Some converts just didn't want to divorce their wives, as was also the case with Jewish husbands in some cases. And others were concerned that the Inquisition might interpret participation in Jewish legal and social rituals as a sign of continued adherence to their former faith. If Giovanni had hesitations about divorcing his wife, however, he had already been convinced to provide the get before he and his ex wife went together to the notary. And the reason that they needed a notarial contract here was not because of the divorce itself that had already been accomplished, but because the expulsion required that they make additional arrangements related to Rika's property. So, in the contract that you see here, Rika agreed to give her real estate holdings to her ex husband and their son, Gaspare. Gaspare's religious identity in this contract is ambiguous. The notary did not overtly describe him as a convert or as a Christian, but also never identified him as a Jew. And context, I would say, suggests that he probably converted alongside his father. So the one reason for this is that Gaspare is not a common name among Sicilian Jews. I have not found any Jewish person, any definitively Jewish person with that name, but is a name found among local Christians. The other reason I think he probably converted is that Rika makes the property grant to both Giovanni and Gaspare, which suggests, I would say, that the father and son probably both were going to remain in Agrigento as Christians while she would be leaving. The property in question is a group of houses in Agrigento, which Rika had inherited from her parents and owned outright, which is an option for women in this period. She transferred the houses not through a sale, but with a type of contract that's called a donatio inter vivos, which literally means a kind of grant or gift between the living. So through this contract, Rika gave the houses to both her ex-husband and to her son, although only Giovanni was actually physically present for this, and Gaspare was at this point still a legal minor. As is often the case with notarial contracts, this document raises as many questions as it answers. Notarial contracts provide a lot of detail about money and property and kinship ties, but often leave out individuals' motivations and omit descriptions of the affective relationships or the kind of personal, the kind of ways that these, family ties actually kind of manifested in a personal way. The contract itself centers Rika as the primary actor. Her name appears first, and she is portrayed as choosing to make this donation. But how much choice did she have? The expulsion undoubtedly would have limited the choices available to her. In just a few short months, she would no longer be able to live in or manage this property and had to do something with it, clearly. Yeah, so either to sell it or give it away. The choices made by her family members also limited Rika's options. In my research so far, I have not found any additional information that would shed any light on Rika's relationship with her now ex-husband. So we have no way of knowing if the fact that she was now required to divorce him might have been a relief. The fact that they're clearly not on the same page about conversion could signal other conflicts, or just generally not necessarily a kind of particularly close relationship. This almost certainly would have been an arranged marriage. Alternatively, however, Rika's divorce might have left her emotionally bereft and or anxious about her financial future. The conversion, moreover, of her minor son, combined with the expulsion, meant that Rika no longer had the option to fight for custody of her child. Undoubtedly, of course, many mothers would be devastated at being forced to abandon their child. Under the circumstances, however, we also have to consider the possibility that allowing him to remain home could have seemed like a better option than the hardships of travel and exile. So, for example, if Gaspare suffered from frequent illnesses or was disabled, his parents could have had concerns about his health if he were forced to travel. So this is absolute speculation, but it's something I mentioned in order to highlight the many additional complicating factors that might have shaped Rika's choices, as well as those of Giovanni and the young Gaspare. And these are things that the notaries would typically not mention. The absence of additional social and emotional context for Rika's choice therefore leaves her donation open to interpretation. Presumably, she could have sold the property instead of gifting it. We have a number of Jews in the wake of the expulsion order who rushed to sell property for local Christians and converts. They didn't always get the best price for it because people knew that they were leaving and didn't have a lot of options, but you could sell it and get something. And it's also possible that she acted under pressure rather than purely by choice. For example, Giovanni could have threatened previously that unless she agreed to give him this property, he would withhold her get or not give her her dowry back. And especially if she were fairly young, she might have hoped to remarry quickly when she were in exile. And with a strict deadline to leave the country, she would have been under pressure to do whatever was necessary to obtain her divorce and gather what financial resources she could before leaving. And there are limits as well about how much exiled Jews can take with them in terms of cash and personal belongings. So given that, the loss incurred by giving away property instead of selling it might have been worth it for peace of mind. The involvement in this contract of her brother-in-law, Sabatino di Rahi, could also point to Rika's desperation and vulnerability. There are plenty of Jewish and Christian women in Palermo who conduct business independently. There's nothing legally preventing them from doing so. The contract, however, stated that Sabatino was acting as her mundualdus, a term that refers to a legal guardian for an adult woman, and that he is giving consent for her to gift this property. And this is a figure that is actually very common in Florence, but not especially common in Sicily. And so his presence here is a bit puzzling. It could suggest that she was very young and especially perhaps inexperienced in handling finances. Um, and so on the one hand, it could indicate that she has kind of limited agency here, that she has family members who are making choices for her. On the other hand, we do have a lot of evidence that Jewish women deliberately rely on male relatives to offset vulnerable positions when dealing with their husbands or ex-husbands. We also, of course, Sabatino's presence raises intriguing but ultimately unanswerable questions about what kind of practical or emotional support Rika might have received from Sabatino's wife, who presumably there must have been Rika's sister. However, we cannot assume that Rika's relationship with her ex-husband was necessarily acrimonious. Ironically, the fact that they had already completed the divorce before concluding this contract could signal relatively good relations between the couple, given that at least he gave her the get before this donation was officially accomplished. Um, we know that a lot of husbands do not do that. A lot of convert husbands delay in giving their wives a get to squeeze more out of them financially. Sicilian Jewish communities actually even petitioned Christian authorities to force convert husbands to divorce their wives before the expulsion deadline because they recognize that this is a problem. And so, in this case, at least, we can't say what kind of social or economic pressures Giovanni exerted, but he at least had relatively quickly granted her a legal divorce. She at least has it several months before she has to leave. And it is entirely possible that her decision to gift her property to her ex-husband could demonstrate some amount of continued goodwill between the former couple. Regardless, it probably does represent an effort to provide for her minor son, who she would have to leave behind in Agrigento. So essentially, this could also be a way for her to transmit to her minor son an inheritance that he would not be able to manage independently at this stage. The decision to give the property to both Gaspare, her son, and Giovanni, her ex-husband, could be a sign that she's acting under pressure. It could also indicate that she does actually trust her ex-husband for, whether she likes him or not, that she trusts him to raise and provide for their son. So if she gave Gaspare just the property directly, it would probably still remain under Giovanni's control while Gaspare was still a minor and would then pass to Gaspare when he came of age. But if you actually trust his father to look out for his best interests, it actually might make sense for him to have fuller control over the property. It might make sense for example, to give him more flexibility if it means, he needs to sell it in order to provide for his son's needs, or to make the decision about when he's actually capable of managing assets independently. The fact that somebody is, 19 doesn't actually mean that they should manage property necessarily. So, you might have concerns about that. So ultimately, her motivations do remain open to speculation, but it is a case that demonstrates some of the challenges that expulsion and mass conversion created for women. These challenges required these complex responses, in which we can see some of the ways that women like Rika had to navigate both Jewish and Christian legal culture. And they also had to grapple with multiple major life changes at once. So in only a few months, right, this woman saw her marriage come to an end and had to leave behind not only her home, but also her son. So conversion might have been the issue that made divorce into a real mass phenomenon in 1492, but it was not the only reason that some Jewish couples found themselves ending their marriages on the eve of the expulsion. Excuse me. So for my second case study, I now turn to a couple who found themselves at odds over the question of migration. As we shall see, however, this couple also had some marital drama that began well before the expulsion was announced. So on November 20th, a Jewish woman named Desijata and her ex-husband, Shiviten Chipu, went to a Christian notary in Palermo to record the division of finances after their recent divorce. And the contract notes that this couple had gotten divorced over a disagreement on where to go when they left Palermo. In terms of further details, however, it remains frustratingly silent. Why did Desijata refuse to emigrate to the place chosen by her husband? So we know that exiles went to places both relatively nearby, so for example, the Kingdom of Naples, as well as places further afield, like North Africa or the Ottoman Empire. But the notary did not specify where either Desijata or Shibitin wanted to go, nor did he explain why Desijata had rejected Shibitin's choice. Maybe she had family members who had decided to go to another location and she preferred to stay with them rather than with her husband. For many medieval women, again, we're assuming the context of an arranged marriage. Sticking with your birth family rather than your spouse might have seemed like a better or safer bet. There are also other things. She could have preferred to go to Naples, where there would have been a local language and customs similar to her own, whereas Shibitin maybe had connections in North Africa or the Ottoman Empire and preferred to travel there. Ultimately, the document only allows us to speculate as to why these circumstances of exile would have proved so divisive for this particular couple. When I first found this contract, I did not necessarily expect that I would get to learn more about Desijata or her troubled marriage. There are plenty of medieval Jewish women who remain entirely absent from the documentary record up until they were widowed and divorced. Moreover, the nature of our documentation means that many aspects of everyday life went unrecorded. However, as I continued to look through the notarial registers from Palermo, I found a second document that raised yet another possible explanation for Shibitin and Desijata's 1492 divorce. The couple's disagreement over whether to immigrate could be disguising over where to immigrate could be disguising 2 years of marital troubles. In late December of 1490, Shibitin signed a betrothal contract with another woman. While many Jews in Palermo drew up Latin notarial betrothal contracts months or even years before they anticipated the marriage taking place, those contracts usually record agreements between couples who are free to marry, or at least would be once one or both parties came of age. This contract, however, was drawn up under more unusual circumstances. The prospective bride, Hannah, was a widow. Shibitin, however, was still married to Desijata, and in this contract he promised that he would divorce her by Passover, several months later. Hannah and Shibitin clearly did not end up getting married in the spring of 1491, as Shibitin remained married to Desijata until sometime after the expulsion order was issued. Bigamy was only treated as an option under unusual circumstances in Aragonese Sicily, so for example, in the case of infertility. But there's no documentary evidence that Shibitin ever sought to pursue that route. However, Shibitin and Hana did maintain ties over this period, or at least renewed them in the wake of the expulsion order. In September of 1492, do I have that document now? In September of 1492, Hana appointed Shibitin as her legal agent, and he subsequently acted on her behalf to sell property that she would need to leave behind. Thus far, at least, I have found no additional information about Desijata, Hana, or Shibitin. We do not know where any of them sought out new homes after the expulsion, or if any of them converted to Christianity, or if Hana and Shibitin ever married once Shibitin had belatedly divorced his wife. Even without knowing the end, however, the story offers intriguing insight into the marital and documentary strategies adopted by Jewish women in response to the expulsion. We have no way of knowing whether the migration disagreement was the real reason for Shibitin and Desijata's eventual divorce, or if it seemingly provided convenient cover to end a troubled marriage. If Desijata had refused to accept the divorce over the last 2 years, which is an option, then Shibitin might have strategically chosen a location he expected she would dislike as a means of pressuring her. Alternatively, Shibitin might have ultimately decided against the divorce, whether for personal or financial reasons. So, for example, if he kind of figured out that, he'd have to give Desijata back a lot of money and did not think he could afford to do so. And Desijata, for her, on her part, might have wanted to end the marriage, especially if she learned about this betrothal contract. She might have not necessarily been so enthusiastic to continue in this marriage. Under these circumstances, Desijata might have refused to migrate to her husband's chosen location in order to force him to divorce her. Regardless of whether or not Desijata wanted the divorce, she did seek to document it with a combination of Latin and Aramaic Hebrew contracts. So this is a combination of documents that would have been helpful if she wanted to establish a new life elsewhere, especially if it's somewhere else under Christian rule, where documents like this would have been very familiar. Whether she hoped to remarry in exile or to live independently, this combination of documents would make her marital status and her claims over assets, which is what's really being kind of worked out in this contract, that would make this intelligible to both local Jewish communities and to Christian legal authorities. We also can see that the Latin documentation is clearly supplementing, not replacing, the Hebrew and Aramaic documentation. They already have the get. And so it offers this additional record of the divorce, but more importantly, it's what is dividing the conjugal estate into his assets and hers, and establishing her control over the financial resources that she would take with her. Hannah also is making her own set of strategic decisions, both before and after the expulsion. It's hard to tell exactly what's going on in terms of her agency in the 1490 betrothal contract. She's represented by her brother, Abraham Dagwa. It's difficult to tell who's pushing for the marriage behind the scenes. Did she want to marry Shibitan? Did her brother want her to marry Shibitan? Who knows? Regardless, however, this contract offered some useful legitimacy to a relationship of potentially dubious legal validity and social acceptability. Given that discourses about sexual honor disproportionately impacted women, Hannah might have found this documentation especially helpful. The fact that she maintained or rekindled some sort of relationship with Shibitan suggests she might have found his support socially or economically useful. Unlike some other Jewish women in Sicily, Hannah is another woman who does not seem to have wanted to conduct business independently. So the only time we see her, she's acting either through her brother or through her legal agent and would-be husband. And, we can't just, there's, certainly something possibly going on in terms of personal feelings, but also her decision to preserve ties with Shibitan despite this failed betrothal, or renew them once he finally divorced his wife, could reflect her preference to rely on men to conduct business, and her sense that she could rely on this particular man to represent her interests. The expulsion was a transformative crisis for Jews across all the kingdoms under the rule of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, including Sicily. Jews were not only uprooted from the places that had been their families' homes for centuries, but also in some cases experienced profound transformations within their own immediate families. The choices that individual Jews made about whether to remain Jewish or to convert to Christianity, and where to migrate in the wake of the expulsion, could necessitate or justify the breakup of family units. It is in itself a challenge to recover how ordinary Jews reacted to the expulsion, rather than the communal institutions that developed an organized response, or the few elites who chronicled their experiences. It is even more challenging, unsurprisingly, to recover and interpret the experiences of Jewish women. Many Jewish women have been silenced altogether and remain fully absent from our documentary evidence. Others, like Rika, Desijata, and Hannah, appear only in these sparse documentary glimpses, which offer mere hints of their lived experiences. On the one hand, these women should not be robbed of agency, robbed by historians of what agency they had. On the other hand, it is crucial that we acknowledge the fact that they undoubtedly experienced distinctly gendered pressures, intertwined with the challenges faced by all Jews. These factors ensured that these women did not make many choices entirely independent of external circumstances. By exploring Jewish responses to the expulsion through the lens of gender, I hope to have highlighted that Jewish women faced unique challenges that reflected their intersectional identities as both women and Jews. Even if they wished to end their marriages, women without marital and family ties would have been in an especially vulnerable position when they migrated to new locales. At the same time, however, the surviving documents suggest that within certain constraints, Jewish women made thoughtful and strategic choices. The decision to obtain and preserve those documents, both those that have survived through copies in Latin notarial registers and those drawn up by Jewish scribes in Hebrew or Aramaic, which have not come down to us directly, this choice was in itself a crucial part of their efforts to protect themselves and establish new lives beyond Sicily. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Are there any questions or comments, reactions from our viewers?
I actually have two questions.
Go for it.
And they're not slanted, they're real questions.
Go for it, Beth.
Okay, so my first question is, you said, I thought you said something like the Christian husband felt coerced or compelled to divorce the Jewish wife. Is that something that's actually coming down through channels, or it's just sort of obvious that since she has to leave anyway, there's no point trying to change her mind? Or
so the Jewish community of Palermo actually, the Jewish community actually goes to Christian authorities to ask them to help them coerce converts into convert men into divorcing their Jewish wives so that these women can leave with a get.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah, so there is then pressure actually coming down from both the Jewish community and from Christian authorities.
Cool. And my other one is this one of the communities where if everybody had agreed, he just could have married both of them at the same time?
So it's essentially, there's a few circumstances under which bigamy is possible. You do have to get you actually have to get royal permission essentially
Wow.
to commit to bigamy, and the main circumstance in which it gets allowed is in cases where where somebody is infertile and they assume it's the wife, essentially, right? So that they've been married for a certain length, for 10 years, and don't have children. Then he could get permission to marry a second wife. The other thing that I will note, though, that could also have made it more difficult is that there are women who actually have a condition in their ketubah, in their marriage contract, saying that their husband cannot marry a second wife, and that if he wishes to do so, he has to just divorce her instead. So that also, I mean, so we don't know in this particular circumstance if, because we don't have their ketubah, so we don't know if that would have been an issue, but it certainly, for some people, is an issue that could have prevented that.
Questions, thoughts? I would love to hear about your sort of like next project, next ambition. What's the future hold in terms of your research interests from here?
Oh wow! So at the moment, this is definitely the project that I'm kind of most in depth focused on. But I also have a project that I'm thinking about kind of links between gender and anti-Judaism. So kind of thinking about basically how kind of Jewish men and women experienced anti-Jewish hostility differently, as well as the kind of gendered roles played by Christian men and women in kind of enacting anti-Jewish hostility. I'm kind of very much at the beginning of that project, but that's the kind of next thing I'm going to be working on in more depth.
That sounds so fascinating and probably more timely now than ever before. So I'm interested in how that kind of fits into or sheds light on the current moment in Jewish life in general.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'll also say, one of the pieces of this project also is kind of thinking about how hostility toward Jews is something that does affect their experience of going to the notary. One thing that I found in some of the other communities that I looked at in Catalonia is that there are basically nasty anti-Jewish caricatures on the covers of notarial registers that are dedicated specifically to Jewish business. One is just a kind of like, hook-nosed Jew with a prominent money bag. One is this guy, there's another city that has two different caricatures that are kind of creating like links between Jews and demons. And those also on the label of the book, these books that the notaries in some places kind of like put all of the documents involving Jews in a few designated registers, and they're called Libri Judaeorum in Latin, which literally means books of the Jews. And in this one town, Manresa, they're actually referred to, a couple of the registers are labeled books of the Jews who are the enemies of God. So, this would be very potentially, right, this would be something that people, saw when they, went to the notary. And the nasty anti-Jew, the hook nose money bag guy, he is actually labeled with the name of a real Jewish man who lived in that city. And you can go through that same register, and that same register that has this like really, nasty picture of him on the cover, it has a bunch of loans that he's making. It has a bunch of loans that his wife's making. It has like his daughter's marriage contract. So
fascinating. Well, we're looking forward to lecture number 3 someday about wherever the research takes you. Any last questions from our audience before we let Professor Ifft Decker go back to her spring break? Well, thank you all for tuning in. It was lovely, lovely to have you back, and excited for our community to have this lecture in our archive of lectures from our Jewish faculty. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of your Friday and early Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Bye.